So there's a couple things that strike me immediately about the film that both lean into the decade with which it was made, as well as divert drastically, I think, in some ways from the decade in which it was made. First, most obvious in the way it leans into the decade is the cast assembled and the characters in the film, both from a actor standpoint as well as the portrayal of said characters, is absolutely like the 80s defined, essentially. Just, Schwarzenegger and Weathers and, all the names, Ventura, and the names that you just, Bill Duke, and all the names that you mentioned. They are so incredibly larger than life and so incredibly distinctive. And it's almost like, we attribute a lot of things back to pro wrestling. Obviously, no coincidence that Jesse Ventura has that pro wrestling background, but nevertheless, each of those main like characters pretty much have like their own gimmick, so to speak, and are very, very distinctive. They are not an interchangeable, undefined, nebulous group. And I think that very much leans into the 80s, where you did see a lot of very larger than life, heavily built and, hyper masculine type of heroes on screen. And Predator leaned into it in giving you an entire team of them, even though obviously front and foremost was Arnold. But also a way that it diverted away, I would say, from more of the 80s archetype, and that it, in some ways, in a very vague, general way, would resemble more conceptually films from maybe like the 70s, is the fact that a lot of classic films in the 80s are very definitively one specific type of genre. The great films of the 80s, like it's an action film. Oh, it's a comedy. It's a romantic comedy. It's a drama. Now, in earlier decades, you would have more of a blending of genres, but still, even then, more among kind of a smaller subsection. You would have, a dramatic thriller. You would have, maybe an action comedy, which became an 80s thing as well. But what Predator did, and it was amazing that it did it so incredibly effectively, was that it took a bunch of very different genres that wouldn't necessarily go well together when looked at by their individual merits, and it actually blended them into an overall film that actually worked better than all of its individual components would have you believe. It's not necessarily on an action front. It's not necessarily the best action film of the 80s. People could argue that it is. It's not necessarily the best sci-fi film of the 80s. People could argue that it is. It's not necessarily the best horror film of the 80s. People could again argue that that one would get more pushback. But you could argue, you make that argument. But what Predator does that so few big budget blockbuster movies had done of the decade was it took a sci-fi film mixed with an action film, mixed with a thriller, mixed with it took all of these individual genres and it actually did justice to each of them through the telling of this story, and did so in a very lean fashion. The movie's still under 2 hours. And I think that is a credit to McTiernan, and as well as a credit to Schwarzenegger for having an overall vision of how this could come together, because he was extremely intelligent and had tremendous control, as we mentioned before when talking about Total Recall, as far as control over how his career was moving forward and who he was working with and who would be trusted with his brand, essentially. But I think that's where Predator stands out. It didn't necessarily do any of those individual things better than others of its ilk, but goddamn if it didn't blend them better than almost any other film that I can think of.
Absolutely. Before I get into any notes, and that was awesome because a lot of what you talked about, we are going to get into. I want to talk about the top of the class here, and the top of the class today comes from Wow Happened. Thank you very much, Wow Happened. Wow Happened actually writes an essay that says Male Bonding Through Xenophobia. Released in 1987, Predator is a film directed by John McTiernan and written by Jim and John Thomas. They were inspired to write the screenplay after a critical review of Rocky IV, which mentioned that eventually Rocky Balboa was going to run out of people on Earth to fight and would have to start fighting people from outer space. Intrigued by this idea, the brothers wrote a screenplay about a group of Vietnam vets working as soldiers of fortune who get more than they bargained for when they encounter an extraterrestrial hunter deep in the jungles of South America. The film was produced by Joel Silver, who also produced Lethal Weapon that same year, and featured a small rewrite by legendary screenwriter David Peoples. The film starred Arnold Schwarzenegger as Dutch, as well as Carl Weathers and Jesse Ventura. With that much testosterone in any film, mayhem is bound to follow. The film features incredible special effects by Stan Winston, fresh off the success of the Aliens franchise. Originally, Jean-Claude Van Damme was hired to play the title role, but an unconvincing costume combined with his shorter height compared to the cast led director McTiernan to recast the role with 7-foot 2-inch actor Kevin Michael Hall, who had just played Bigfoot in the film Harry and the Hendersons. The voice of Optimus Prime, Peter Cullen, provided the voice of the Predator. The title creature, along with the hit cast, launched an entire franchise. Arnold's iconic line late in the film to "get to the choppa" is one of his most imitated and hilariously quoted lines of his entire career. And while several films have been made in the Predator franchise, none have been as memorable as this one. Thank you very much, Wow Happen. We certainly appreciate you being this week's top of the class.
And we also have to give credit to another very famous one-liner from that film, and it doesn't even come from Schwarzenegger. It comes from Ventura. I ain't got time to bleed. That was the name of Ventura's autobiography. It was so well known.
First book.
Yep.
Absolutely. So, with all that being said, let's get into it. These are the notes from Professor Bailey on Predator. And once again, Dave, some of the things that you've already talked about, we're going to get into. Jump in when you like. Predator opens with a science fiction shot, and then it's just sort of forgotten about. It is a very, very beautiful opening to a film because you start to think you're getting ready to watch a Star Wars, Star Trek, Last Starfighter, something happening with stars and spaceships and aliens. And then the film, very well told by McTiernan, just lets it go. You don't really think about science fiction anything for quite some time into this film. Dutch's crew are, quite frankly, in my opinion, a prototype for what would come later called the Expendables. Totally. The team is oddly and bizarrely and unexpectedly endearing. His mercenary team, from a viewership standpoint, I don't know whether you're a guy or a girl, his mercenary team is highly, highly endearing. You start to like them immediately, and you really start to understand each of them. But later on, there'll be an actual line that Carl Weathers, Dylan, actually says, "You're an asset. You're an expendable asset." And to me, it's really it just strikes of this might have just become the prototype for something that another action hero put together many, many years later. Because watching it when I was a kid, I know it's about Predator. I know it's about a bunch of guys being hunted by what we would get to know as the Predator in this film. But many times when I was growing up, I just wanted to see this mercenary team. I thought there should be like prequels to this film where you get to see this mercenary team doing, rescue missions all over God's green earth, and it has nothing to do with the Predator. That's how much I enjoyed the team that you're seeing at the beginning of this film, this expendable team.
Right.
Dutch and Dylan, played by Arnold and Carl Weathers, are like a more grown-up, over-masculine relationship version of almost Han and Lando and Empire. You can tell they're friends. You can tell there's history. You can tell that absolutely, without a doubt, Dutch does not trust Dylan.
You
and it
son
gets
of a
worse throughout the
bitch.
film. You son of a bitch. Yeah, the most masculine handshake on the planet Earth happens in that scene. But they said it really well. And this film is also great for a lot of people out there that ever wanted to piss all over Arnold Schwarzenegger's acting abilities. He does such good work in just his eyes and his body. You can tell he has so much distrust for what's getting ready to happen. With Dylan being a CIA pencil pusher at this point, where obviously they had had some military experience in the past. Dutch does not trust Dylan, and like I said, it gets worse from there.